series of webinars on regional security, on latest developments in the global affairs. And today we have the pleasure and honor to have two distinguished experts and political scientists. Andreas Umland is the German political scientist who is recently currently is in Kiev, who is working on the story, Russian and Ukraine history. He is the author of the book about Russia and the post-Soviet regimes, and he is the senior expert to the Kiev Institute at the. I'm sorry, let me to make it senior expert for the Ukrainian Institute for the Future in Kiev, as well as he is the research fellow in the Stockholm Center to Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And as I told you, he is the general editor of the book series of Soviet and post-Soviet politics and society. I follow closely, and Mr. Umland is very, very active on posting, writing the articles about the developments in Ukraine, the global security affairs, international affairs. So it will be a great pleasure to listen to share your views, Mr. Umland, with us today. Mr. Tornike Gordadze is our Georgian colleague, the political scientist. He is the professor at Paris Institute of Political Studies. He is a former Georgian politician. He used to be the deputy foreign minister of Georgia and the state minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. In fact, I had the pleasure really to succeed Mr. Tornike Gordadze and to continue the work which has been done under his leadership in the State Minister's Office for Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic integration. I really valued your participation today in our webinar. And well, without further ado, I will ask Mr. Umland to share with us his views about the Black Sea security, the developments in the Black Sea region. How is it viewed in Ukraine and Kiev? The threats, challenges, and perspectives of Ukraine in upcoming and nearest future. Mr. Umland, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. And perhaps instead of commenting just on some topical events like the concentration of Russian troops on the Russian-Ukrainian border or the Biden-Putin summit, I want to speak about I think what is the crucial background and the crucial determinant of all of these problems. And that is what I would call the under-organization of a part of Eastern Europe, into which I would include also the Southern Caucasus, namely that there are a number of countries that have neither entered the EU or NATO, nor on the other hand have succumbed to the sort of new domination by Moscow, like countries like Belarus and Armenia. And there are in particular these four, as I would call them, gray zone countries, the Guam countries. You could also summarize them: Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Azerbaijan, and that their problems are, I think, determined foremost and crucially, and I would even see these as a sufficient explanation that these countries are not organized internationally, that they are outside the crucial organizations that they are perhaps members of the OSCE, the UN, or the Council of Europe, but not not all of them, of course, but not all of the Eastern Partnership countries, but still that they are not integrated. And here for Ukraine and also, I guess, for Georgia, the primary issue is that of NATO accession, which I think is a very sad story. And when I'm asked here in Ukraine, in Kiev, about the prospects of a membership action plan for Ukraine, I usually point towards Georgia. And I say that Georgia has been ready for a membership action plan, if not for accession to NATO, already for quite some time. But Georgia has not even received a membership action plan. And that is against the background that Georgia has, for a much longer time already, a majority of the population supporting NATO membership, has for a longer time, a close cooperation with NATO, and that Georgia also does not have a hot conflict with, or a simmering, let's put it that way, conflict with Russia. It has a conflict, a territorial conflict with Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region, which is de facto a conflict with Russia, but it's a frozen conflict, fortunately, perhaps, whereas Ukraine does not even have a frozen conflict. It has a simmering, one could say, conflict, and that's why I think Ukraine is even further away from NATO accession and even from a membership action plan than Georgia. And as long as there's no advance with Georgia, I think there's no hope for Ukraine to get further. And in a way, this is a almost redundant thing to say, but you know, if you followed the news about Ukraine over the last weeks, Zelensky has very much raised again this topic, also a very popular topic for Poroshenko, but also recently Zelensky has very much come forward with the idea of getting a membership action plan and asking all the time, you know, when are we finally going to become members of NATO? But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. Here, the problem may even be as stark as that. At least Ukraine, I don't know as much about Georgia, but at least Ukraine, I think, may only become a member of NATO when it may not need NATO membership that much anymore. That means once the conflict with Russia is resolved somehow, once we had perhaps a regime change with Russia, something like that in Russia, but it may be as sad as that. And maybe a similar story goes for Georgia, but as I said, I don't know as much about Georgia. And there has been actually some research now about possible ways, at least for Georgia's accession to NATO, with some sort of special agreement, special accession treaty that would then exclude the Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region. But I don't think that is something like that is even possible now for NATO. Oddly, I'm somewhat more optimistic here about the EU, because I think that the association agreements are actually far more than association agreements. In a way, they are mislabeled. They are de facto integration agreements. And once and when Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, which have these especially large association agreements, once they have succeeded in implementing most or all of these stipulations in these large agreements, they will already be largely parts of the EU's legal and economic area or space. And therefore, then actually the accession to the EU would not any longer be that much of a step. And also, the EU does not have the sort of geopolitical load, one could say, perhaps, as NATO. So it's a less controversial issue in Western-Russian relations. So in a sense, I'm actually unlike most other experts, at least here in in Ukraine, I'm somewhat more optimistic concerning eventually a membership perspective from the EU, and then a start of negotiations about accession, and then finally accession to the EU. That is a view that I think is not held by many people, at least not here in Ukraine. But because of the special nature of the association agreements, I think that will be the trajectory. I've published here a number of ideas that are also partly inspired by the Georgian example, how Ukraine could, enhance its European integration and sort of accelerate the accession process with the EU. One of the proposals I've made here with a colleague was to introduce for citizens of the EU an automatic permanent residence permit. So whenever a EU citizen comes to Ukraine for a longer period, I would propose Ukraine should offer these EU citizens, and perhaps also citizens of other countries, the US, Switzerland, Norway, and so on, Australia perhaps, a permanent residence permit, because that is part of the EU accession anyway. And Ukraine already had a sort of somewhat similar positive experience with that, with first introducing in 2005 a visa-free regime for EU citizens, and then getting in as a response then from the EU the visa-free regime in 2017. So there's already a positive experience here, and what one could sort of try something similar here with the permanent residence permit. Is perhaps not as easy as with the visa-free regime, but at least that is something that that Ukraine could do. And Ukraine is losing I think around 500,000 people per year anyway. So the population of Ukraine is falling down quite rapidly. So whoever comes here should be allowed to stay and work and study here. Also but still, I think both NATO accession and EU accession are many years away. And what I'm trying to communicate here in Ukraine, and I wonder how much that also applies to Georgia, is that the politicians and experts and diplomats and so on should somewhat redirect their attention from NATO and EU accession, and they should think about sort of intermediate solutions to enhance their security by way of entering other security arrangements or other integration schemes. And the structures that here come to mind are the Three Seas initiative, which is so far an intra-EU initiative of East European member states of the European Union to develop their transport and energy infrastructure. Austria, for some reason, is also part of the Three Seas initiative. And I could imagine that countries, at least like Ukraine and Moldova, and perhaps even Georgia, could and should become members of the Three Seas initiative. There's also a group within NATO called the Bucharest 9 group, which is so far also an intra-NATO grouping that is sort of concerned with the eastern flank of NATO. And perhaps there may be a possibility in the future to also include, at least as associate members or something like that, countries like Ukraine and Georgia into this intra-NATO grouping, the Bucharest 9 group. Another option that appears to me perhaps as a sort of intermediate solution is to try to replicate for the Guam region, or at least for Ukraine and Georgia, something like the US has done in the Baltic countries with the Baltic Charter, and in the Western Balkans with the so-called Adriatic Charter, which is a sort of a special arrangement between the US and countries that aspire to become NATO, but have not yet become members of NATO, or that have already actually become members of NATO, but that want the special relationship with the US. So perhaps something like Guam Charter or a Black Sea Charter or something like that could be an option here to increase the security of countries like Georgia and Ukraine. Moldova and Azerbaijan are of course different because they have no official NATO membership perspective and also no official aspiration to enter NATO. But still, perhaps if the US could come forward here with something like that, that could be also an intermediate solution because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will have probably to wait for several years for Ukraine to get a membership and also for Georgia to get a membership action plan and a membership from NATO and a membership perspective from the EU. And one has to think, I think, more intensely than before about what to do for this sort of interregnum. I think both countries will become members of NATO, and Moldova will also in addition, become a member of the EU, like Ukraine and Georgia. But the big question is, of course, what to do in the meantime and how to increase security. A peculiar, maybe I finish with that, a peculiar solution that Ukraine or option that Ukraine here also has that at least currently Moldova and Georgia do not have is an upgrading of the so-called Budapest Memorandum, which is related to the fact that Ukraine, unlike Moldova and Georgia, inherited after the breakup of the Soviet Union nuclear weapons, therefore got this Budapest Memorandum, and at least Ukraine could build an argument vis-a-vis especially the US and Great Britain, but also vis-a-vis the world. One could say that it should get some stronger security guarantees and security assurances than in the Budapest Memorandum, because the Budapest Memorandum has now been devalued by Russia, which also signed it, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. And in a way, the example of Azerbaijan illustrates why this is important, because Azerbaijan has, in 2010, partly at least solved this issue of being in a gray zone for itself. It has signed a mutual aid pact with Turkey, a fully ratified agreement, which has a military dimension. And last year we saw the outcome of this, in a way, of this Turkish-Azeri pact, which I think the Nagorno-Karabakh operation, let's call it that way, that Azerbaijan carried out last year would not have been possible without this Turkish Azeri pact and their partnership. And I wouldn't go as far as with the Azeri example here, that Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova should also get foreign partners in trying to reconquer occupied territories, but at least that is certainly not advisable when you have as your enemy not just a country like Armenia, but you actually have Russia as your enemy. That would be very unadvisable to do, even with foreign partners. But at least the Azeri example illustrates that once you are internationally organized, once you have security arrangements, then things look very different. And even if you have just with one major military power a mutual aid pact, that already principally changes your geopolitical situation, and that is what I think Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova also need.
Thank you, Andreas, for very thought-provoking ideas and your presentation. We will certainly come back with a number of questions to your suggestions, to your views. But now I would like to give the floor to Tornike and ask him to speak about the outcomes and conclusions of the summits which took place a few days ago in Brussels, in Cornwall, and in Geneva. The final act of the bilateral meeting between President Biden and Vladimir Putin. How is it viewed in Europe? How is United States back? Is this the only result for this first European trip for President Biden?
Hello.
And is the situation deteriorating or escalating? Please, Tornike, the floor is yours.
Alex, your voice is cut, but I heard the question. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this web seminar. The summits, so this, I think the order of meetings was very important for the American president. He started with G7 meeting, then was NATO summit, then was a summit with the leadership of the European Union in Brussels, and he ended with the meeting with the Russian president. There were many critics from our friends, our supporters in the US and in Europe about before the last meeting between Biden and Putin. People in Eastern Europe especially were afraid of some kind of trade that would come over the heads of Ukraine and other countries under the Russian threat, especially after the fact that Biden administration lifted sanctions on the companies who are involved in Nord Stream 2 project. But it didn't happen. And I explained this American motivation to meet the Russian president with the desire for Biden to show the Vladimir Putin that America was back in Europe and that there was an unanimity among the European allies of the United States, and the period of tensions that emerged after Donald Trump took the presidency in starting from 2013, was finished. And now there were no significant divergence of views between the European partners and the United States. And with the meetings in the framework of G7, he wanted also to show that on a global level, countries like beyond transatlantic unity, like countries like Japan and probably beyond like Australia or other democracies, the countries who share the same values were also united behind the United States. So reinforced with these alliances, the fact that some commercial issues were also discussed with the European leaders, and that this commercial war is appeased now between the United States and Europe. It doesn't mean that everything was solved, but there's a clear message that these issues are going to be appeased, or there are discussions to find solutions. And after these meetings, he went to see Vladimir Putin. He went to see Vladimir Putin also because the American leadership clearly identified China, and it was also underlined in the final communique of the NATO summit, that China is now the systemic rival of the West and of the United States. Systemic rival means that China is not only economic rival, but also in lots of aspects, in lots of different aspects, military-wise, economy-wise, commercial-wise, ideology-wise, etc. So China is the country that can clearly pose a problem to the Western community of states. Russia is the problem, but Russia has no capacity to challenge the West on all the issues. First of all, Russia, economically speaking, doesn't represent a serious threat. Russia's GDP is slightly more than Spanish GDP and less than Italian GDP. So basically, Russia is not an economic power, but with a nuclear. The only comparative advantage of Russia is that Russia is a big nuclear power, and the only one that can sustain, at least in terms of quantity, the competition on nuclear level with the United States. So Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden wants, as China is designed as a main systemic challenge, to have at least predictable relations with Russia. It doesn't mean that he's ready to give up the Western interests in Europe. He was pretty clear about different aspects, about the cyber issues, even about Ukraine. We wanted more, of course, but he was very firm and clear about these issues. At the same time, he offered what maybe Putin wanted. It's a kind of, I wouldn't say rehabilitation, but giving him the possibility to use this meeting as also a victory, both internally in Russia, because he appeared as one of the world leaders, and also on the world level. It's kind of to legitimize Russia as what the Russians really want all the time. We all know that there's this famous Russian phrase that all of us, at least once in our lives, we heard from our Russian interlocutors, "Ты меня уважаешь." So he got this respect from the American president. At the same time, he got the clear explanation that there was no way to launch same kind of agreement as Obama did during his first term of presidency, meaning reset, or even not this kind of soul-searching dialogue that George W. Bush had at the beginning of at the first meeting with Putin. So the only thing that Biden offered to Russia is some kind of respect. And this is not that much compared to what Obama or even George W. Bush offered during the first meetings with the Russian president. Many people are not happy with the apparent weakness of talking points on Navalny. As the American president mentioned Navalny, and he said that if Navalny dies, it would be a red line. It means that keeping Navalny in prison is now as a fait accompli, kind of accomplished fact, and there's no discussion about it. Same thing about Ukraine. So the involvement or the annexation of Crimea or the military adventure of Russia in eastern Ukraine is not anymore a red line, or at least, but the American president mentioned that Russia should be more constructive in the framework of the Minsk agreement, etc. So there was no clear demand from the American president to withdraw the troops from the occupied regions of Ukraine and to reverse the occupation, the annexation of the Crimea. Of course, this can so most of critics of the American president can underline these issues, but at the same time, the objective was not to make the relations even worse. The objective was to make relations between between the U.S. and Russia more predictable. That's why there were no strong messages, at least in public, because there was a 2 hours meeting, tete-a-tete meeting between the two presidents. Then larger delegations joined, and at the end there were these two press conferences. There was not a joint press conference, which is also a sign, but the fact that the American president gave the priority, so that Putin was the first to speak, also was kind of sign that that could serve Putin as to claim that he was now recognized as a leader. So this is about this bilateral meeting. Now coming to NATO summit. For the Europeans, it was a very important summit because they were kind of relieved after 4 years of Trump presidency, because now there are no doubts about the survival of NATO, about the role the United States want to play inside the alliance. NATO is not considered as obsolete as the previous American president claimed, and the fact that Americans are now back in NATO gives really a relief to many member states, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. There are still divergences, of course. Even the fact that discussions, the American engagements and will to put China on NATO agenda was not, to be honest, met with great enthusiasm from some NATO member states, France and Germany, because first, Germany has a very important commercial relations and investment relations with China, and they are more hesitant to consider China as an enemy. Okay, it's a challenge, but still, the Germans and the French, they do not want to be in conflict, open conflict with China, because they do not feel that they are directly threatened, at least security-wise, from China. And also, these two countries, and especially France, considers that appearing always behind the United States is not very good for French sovereignty, and also for this concept that the French President Macron wanted to push after his election, which was called European sovereignty. So there is an alignment of positions on various issues, but also some European countries, especially France and Germany, want to underline that they are members of this transatlantic unity, but they have some specific views on some specific issues. I think we can come back to other questions later on. I will stop here.
Thank you, Tornike, for your very insightful analysis of the summits which took place, and we will certainly come back to the issues which are related to China. I want also Andreas to reflect on how he sees the future relationship between West and China, between United States and China, and Europe within this triangle of United States, China, and Europe. Do we expect there will be new Cold War between West and China, bearing in mind the positions of France and Germany, who are hesitant to call the enemy, as Tornike rightly mentioned, China, but they are calling it a systemic challenge. But coming back to your your ideas regarding the bilateral relations and security agreements between Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and the United States. I will tell you that there are some discussions here in Georgia, and some politicians also openly invited the United States to establish the military presence, and there were some suggestions. I agree and I support this idea. I signed myself the joint open letter to the United States administration to consider this, to have the presence of the on the rotational basis of US militaries here in Georgia. But there is also a view that if we go this way, I mean, on taking the bilateral US Georgia, US Ukraine, or US Black Sea security platform, we may deviate from our path towards NATO. Do you think it is possible to have both bilateral and NATO integration perspectives, and how realistic is to work with the United States? Ukraine, I know that is going to ask for new extra security arrangements from the members, I mean the Western members of the Budapest Memorandum, because Russia really does not care about the international agreements. It has shown all of the times we have witnessed that they do not really respect international agreements. What would be your view and the perspective of bilateral security arrangements in parallel with the with NATO membership aspiration?
Yeah, I agree. Russia respects only force, and that is something that unfortunately is not well understood in Western Europe. I think it's well understood in Eastern Europe. It's well understood, or better understood, in North America. But in countries, at least like Germany, that I know well, this sort of thinking is geopolitical thinking, or sort of in realist terms, is unfortunately not very popular. There is the idea that we should have dialogue and we should talk and always talk, and somehow this will solve the issues. Yeah, I did not mention here the major non-NATO ally status, because that is something that is the sort of general scheme that the US has for the non-NATO member countries. But this has so far never led to countries that got this status, has never led them to become members of NATO. So in a way, this is a tricky proposal that is also often made and also popular here. I would say on balance, I would be for something like the major non-NATO ally status, because as I mentioned, I think the prospect of actually entering NATO are far away, in spite of the existing membership perspective, the explicit and written membership perspective from 2008. And then countries like Ukraine and perhaps also Georgia, they should take whatever they can get from the US. And then the major non-NATO ally status would be something. I mean, and I mentioned the charter scheme, the Adriatic Charter and the Baltic Charter, and of course, both Georgia and the US have already bilateral charters with the US. And one idea I've communicated here with a Ukrainian politician called Irina Vereshchuk. We also went to Tbilisi and presented this idea in Tbilisi. Was to upgrade these charters, these bilateral charters that Ukraine and Georgia have already with the US, to some sort of trilateral or multilateral construct that would sort of be a step forward. I mean, the ideal sort of bilateral relationship would be, of course, something along the lines of the prototypical South Korean US Treaty of 1953, a mutual aid pact. I mean, if that were possible, that's almost as good as NATO, one could argue, because then you have actually the US in a military alliance, but I'm not sure whether that's possible. I wish it were. It may be still easier to achieve, because then you have only you need the agreement of one country. With NATO, you need all the West Europeans, and my suspicion is there will be always some West European country or a country like Hungary that has now become basically a saboteur of Ukrainian NATO relations that will delay membership action plan and an accession. So yeah, I think the Ukraine and Georgia are here in the unfortunate situation then that I think that they should try to get whatever they can get from the Western countries or from other East European countries. Another scheme that some people have discussed is somehow upgrading Guam, Organization of Economic Development and Democracy, but perhaps, and there was the attempt, I think few people actually noted it at the time. In December 2005, there was an attempt by Viktor Yushchenko to establish something like an intermarium coalition of NATO EU member countries of Eastern Europe and the Southern Caucasus, and non-NATO EU, well, non-NATO EU member countries of the Eastern Europe and the Southern, and NATO EU member countries of Eastern Europe. That was the I think the Commonwealth of Democratic Choice, or it was called. It was a short-lived and abortive, unfortunately, an abortive attempt to create some sort of intermarium coalition, but that also didn't work out. So yeah, I think one has to be creative. There's no other choice here. I suspect it's similar in Georgia, that people talk a lot about the membership action plan and the accession to NATO, but sometimes I have the impression that actually this is almost a discussion from a parallel world, that this is more of a distraction, actually. And because the entire public sphere seems to be filled with this aim, it sort of hinders the discussion of alternative schemes, or of that certainly will be worse than NATO membership. That also has to be admitted, that whatever other scheme you may find will not provide the same degree of security as full NATO membership, but still some sort of other schemes are maybe easier to achieve. So
okay.
Yeah. About China, you also wanted me to say something.
Sure.
Well, I mean, my only comment, I've written on this in 2014 a little bit, when Russia obviously had the aim of sort of compensating itself for the loss of the Western partner of the EU with achieving a new Eastern partner in China. And I think in principle here, I wouldn't overestimate this, although there have now been a lot of symbolic steps in the Chinese-Russian relationship, and a sort of public demonstration of all of that. The problem here being is that there is no Asian Union as an alternative to the European Union, or some sort of there's no Asian civilization, if you like, or Eurasian civilization. There is something like European civilization, or Western civilization on the basis, and if you include Russia into this, then you can have some sort of long-term, deeper integration. But that is not something that is really, it's an ad hoc alliance that Russia and China currently have. The alliance becomes, with every year, more and more unequal, because China continues to grow fast, not as fast as it used to be, but still relatively fast, and Russia is basically stagnating. So I wouldn't be too positive about this in terms of Moscow's term about this relationship. I don't think there will be anything similar to this sort of common European house that Gorbachev has once talked about. There is no common Asian house. I think there are different competitors in Asia which have more or less good relationships, but there's simply no cultural foundation for some sort of deeper integration in Asia. There's a lot of obviously political calculation here and political similarity between Russia and China, but there's no deeper cultural ground for this. That's why I think this Russian-Chinese entente, it has been called, should not be overestimated. And certainly, I think the West should not make any sort of concessions towards Russia, for instance, concerning the conflicts in Ukraine and Georgia, with the aim of trying to achieve some sort of Russian membership in a sort of Western or Christian, if you like, anti-Chinese alliance. I think that is not necessary to do, because there will be no deep integration between security or economic integration between Russia and China.
Thank you. Thank you, Tornike. You wanted to add?
Yes, I will answer your questions. I will try to be brief. First, about the future prospects of Georgia with NATO or even bilateral agreement with the US. To start with, I agree with Andreas to say that we should, Georgia and Ukraine, continue constant efforts and to integrate NATO and also to propose different strategies, etc., to be as flexible as possible, as patient as possible, but still keep on this track. But at the same time, the last summit showed that at least in this sequence, at this in near future, there's no clear prospect of membership. The declaration was, to be honest, quite weak about Ukraine and Georgia. I don't remember. So each time we both were present on different NATO summits, and each time there was something new. At least sometimes it was an attempt to show that there is something new, a new formula or enhanced cooperation or something, or to show that there was a step towards the membership, and that was a new, that Georgia and Ukraine were closer. Especially Georgia was closer than 2 years ago or 4 years ago to the membership. This time we didn't see anything similar, and this is of course not very encouraging. That's why I think in parallel, Georgia and Ukraine should think about some other options of enhancing their security, and with the same partners, those who are members of NATO, but maybe on bilateral, trilateral track. I also, together with you, co-signed this letter when State Secretary Pompeo was visiting Georgia. I signed this letter without having clearly the hope that immediately something would follow, but it was also to show them that the readiness of Georgia and of the experts, those people who represent Georgia's foreign policy, at least on not on the decisional level, but on the level of experts or former people who were involved in these issues. But to be honest, I also have a little bit some doubts about the ability of the current Georgian government to push on this, because their attitude and their policy since the last several years was always low profile, to not creating any kind of difficulties for Russia, or to that's why also Georgia is much less present on the international agenda. And if President Biden mentioned Ukraine several times during the bilateral meeting with Putin, he didn't mention Georgia at all. And this is also at least a huge part of responsibility lays on the current authorities of Georgia, who are not active enough to push Georgia on international agenda. On the contrary, their attitude was to avoid any kind of complication with Russia, and they indirectly or directly they contributed to the. It seems that Georgia is happy with the status quo, with the occupation of Georgian territories, etc. So at least this is perceived like this, and no one will become proactive taking Georgia on the international agenda if the Georgians are not active and not pushing themselves. And last point on these questions is Andreas mentioned briefly Azerbaijan and Turkey and their agreement. Turkey is a very interesting case. Turkey is a NATO member, and despite the difficulties that inside this alliance and the difficult relations between the US and Turkey, between some European NATO members and new member states and Turkey, this tendency of the last few years of rapprochement between Turkey and Russia has clear limits. It cannot go beyond what we have now. This is clearly there's no other additional horizon for this Turkey-Russia rapprochement, because these countries at the end of the day remain rivals. They remain rivals in Middle East, in Syria, they remain rivals in Libya, very clearly. they remain rivals in the Caucasus, because Turkey-Azerbaijan alliance cannot please Russia, and the Russians are not very happy with this cooperation. They were more or less forced to include Turkey somehow in this agreement that was signed between Armenia and Azerbaijan under Russian mediation in November 2020. But for the first time, they had to admit some kind of Turkish security presence in the territory, the Southern Caucasus, that they consider as their exclusive zone of influence. So, and there is clear signs that now Turkey wants to improve its relations both with the European countries. We saw very difficult, very strong opposition between Turkey and France, between Turkey and Greece, some tensions with Germany and tensions with the US. These tensions will not disappear tomorrow, because the American president started with the recognition of the Armenian genocide of 1915, but there are clear moves from the Turkish side to reverse this bad tendency, negative tendency of the last years. And there were discussions with Greece and Cyprus, with France, with other partners in the Mediterranean, and we see that Turkey is a little bit coming back to a more classical position that Turkey occupied during the decades. We saw the very interesting security cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey, which is now gaining momentum, and there are clear signs of the cooperation in terms of production of the military industry, etc. Georgia could be interested also to join this. We should find a form how Georgia could be involved in this security dialogue between Turkey, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, without directly implying Turkish military presence in Georgia, because it is something that politically is very difficult in Georgia. But at the same time, to have some enhanced military cooperation with this important NATO member. You mentioned the US-South Korea agreement of 1953. There were lots of other agreements immediately after when the Cold War started, and there was one agreement before even Turkey joined NATO. There was this agreement between Middle Eastern countries like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and America in the 40s to stop the Soviet advance in the Middle East. So it is not the direct zone of responsibility of NATO, but there could be something of this kind in our region. And maybe the last point about China and these Russian-Chinese relations. Of course, I think Biden has no illusion that America will divide or use Russia against China, this kind of neo-Kissingerian approach, but on the reverse. I think this is something, there were illusions about this. Even the French president had illusions about this when he said that he wanted to view history in a long-term vision, when Russia is part of the European civilization and Russia should be on the sides of Europe and the West, confronting the China. I think the nature of these two regimes, authoritarian nature of these regimes, make them closer, and there's a strong cooperation in terms of sharing their experience of strengthening the authoritarian rule between these two countries, and this will always prevent rapprochement between the West and Russia, unless Russia one day becomes a democracy, etc., which is unfortunately would not come very soon. So I think, despite the fact that Russia is very much preoccupied by the strength of China, especially economic expansion of China, they will not. They would rather prefer to be with China and than to appear as a partner with the West. And the fact that some of the Russian systemic liberals. We all know that some of the Russian experts who come to Europe and to the US, they are part of the system, but they sometimes they have a different view from Kremlin. They would tell us, we are civil, as you said, we are part of a European civilization. We're a Christian country, and honestly, we prefer to come to Davos than to go to Chinese kind of Davos. But this is something that for me is aimed at the objective of this to divide the West on this issue and to make them doubt about maybe Russia. There is still a hope to have Russia on our side. This is the last point I wanted to say about.
Thank you very much, Toniki. I want to both of you to reflect on developments in Belarus. How to deal with Belarus, how to deal with Lukashenko. And Lukashenko is and Belarus is militarily integrating with Russian Federation on a daily basis. After the Air Piracy Act, European Union is preparing this whole set of economic sanctions on Belarus. What should be the ways to deal with Belarus? And do you expect, and is Ukraine expecting that Belarus, after worsening, after this Air Piracy Act and the reactions from the Ukrainian president, is Ukraine expecting that Belarus will start accepting the annexation of Crimea? And may Belarus accept the independence of, recognize the independence of so-called states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia? How to deal with Belarus? There are two sides of the coin. Do you think, Andreas, that Belarus could go that far to accept the annexation legally as the South Ossetia?
Well, I see that the development seems to be in the other direction, that we have now a sort of a national movement in Belarus that a few years ago many would have not thought being possible, that with the flag and a sort of reassertion of Belarusian identity that seemed to have been almost lost already in the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. And now suddenly we have this this new polity, I would say, or political landscape in Belarus that I think I would think is a huge headache for Moscow, because it makes the idea of a union state. And the Union State Treaty, by the way, I think it was signed in 1999, is a fully ratified treaty, both from the Russian and Belarusian side. But now with this national movement in Belarus, that has become difficult to implement. And it would have been perhaps for Putin now a very convenient option with the upcoming State Duma elections to have another annexation, basically, after the Crimea annexation, to now also include Belarus into the Russian state, and then sort of reconfigure public discourse in Russia again from socioeconomic issues to these geopolitical issues. But that is now becoming more complicated with this different Belarus that we have now since last summer. What the West can do here is difficult to say, because the sanctions policy is certainly the only basically instrument that the West has. But if the West overdoes it with the sanctions, it could also mean that Belarus will be, after all, driven into this union with Russia, and perhaps that public opinion would not support sectoral sanctions. I think most people probably support the individual sanctions against the regime members, but sectoral sanctions are more tricky here because because Belarus is still an ambivalent country, and I would say not like Ukraine, and a too harsh sanctioning policy could, as I said, drive Belarus into Russia's hands. Well, Ukraine has now suddenly taken a rather tough or hawkish position on Belarus. It used to be more cautious on this because Lukashenko had this sort of ambivalent relationship to Ukraine, and was also seen by at least some Ukrainian observers as a sort of covert ally of Ukraine against Russia, in that at least as long as Belarus is not part of Russia, the Ukrainian-Belarusian border is not as much of a security issue as it could otherwise be. So it's a tricky situation, and frankly, I'm not sure also what to do here, both for Ukraine and the West, how they should behave in all of this. I think that we would simply have to wait what happens inside Belarus. But I should also admit that I'm not that much of an expert on Belarus. Maybe Thornike has some other ideas and comments on this. I find it difficult actually to comment on that.
I'm not an expert of Belarus either, but
Andreas mentioned that Ukraine has the tough Belarus. Ukraine's president has toughened its position.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah. Andreas mentioned that Ukrainian president has toughened its position towards Belarus. What should Georgia do? What do you think? Is it should Georgia take the same position? And what do you think?
First, I think Georgia has to show solidarity with the people of Belarus, and with also the measures taken by our allies, by the Europeans, and by the US. Ukraine has much more trade with Belarus than Georgia has. So if Ukrainians went that far, it means that Georgia can do the same, because I don't think Georgia will be punished, at least economically speaking, by the Belarus. And when it comes to the recognition of the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we saw that Lukashenko clearly abandoned his sovereignty, and now he's entirely in the hands of Putin. But at the same time, he's the person who will fight until the end to keep something for him, to keep something, to negotiate something with Russia. Now he's trying to please Putin. He's committing these crazy acts like this piracy act, and also communicating to Putin some secret conversations between German and Polish secret services, allegedly saying that they poisoned Navalny. Or so this is ridiculous. But at the same time, he's now in the mood to appear as one of the most loyal allies and faithful allies of Putin, but he will keep some cards in his hands, and I don't think he will use these cards of recognition of Abkhazia and the annexation of Crimea just like that. He clearly refused that in 2008 and 2009, and he very clearly declared his support of territorial integrity of Ukraine and Georgia. He even supported territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. So he's the constant stance on these issues was the support of the territorial integrity of the former Soviet Union republics. And I don't think now Russia is ready also to annex Belarus, because I agree with what Andreas said. First, there will be much more resistance from the Belarusian population and society than it would happen 10 or 15 years ago. First, and also I think Russia paid a high price, internationally speaking, after the annexation of Crimea. Russia will it will make Russia's relations with the rest of the world even more complicated, and economically speaking also. 10 million Belarusians, it's another it's another headache, economically speaking, for Russia, because since the annexation of Crimea, billions of dollars were poured into the region, and many other many Russians were unhappy with that. That was one of the main objections of Navalny. He was not attacking this imperialistic nature of Russian state, but more why we are spending our money for our geopolitical adventures. We should pay this and use this money for for development of Russia, etc. So I don't think Russia is now ready to annex and try to abolish Belarusian statehood for these reasons. And I would expect that Lukashenko will not be, will not take measures in the sense of recognition of the annexation of Crimea and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, unless it will be one of his last cards, let's say. And he will try to avoid this as much as he can. It's my hope.
Okay, thank you very much, Tornike and Andreas. We are running out of time, but I have very last question for Tornike. My colleague Marika Mikiashvili is asking. You mentioned that Russia is not seen as a solid threat due to its relative weakness in certain areas, economically in particular. But in this light, can we be overlooking Russia's disinformation and subversive efforts to compensate for conventional weaknesses?
Yes, here Russia is clearly a rival and a threat, and it was underlined. NATO has created this specific center to counter Russian cyber actions several years ago. So Russia is taken seriously by NATO and by the United States on this front, and the fact that Biden mentioned this and draw a red line, which was differently appreciated by different experts. Some would say that it would mean that Russia, beyond the 16 points or 15 or 16 points he mentioned, Russia could attack other sites of interest on the American territory. No, I think it was at least for Biden's administration to tell Russia that there'll be a retaliation directly, and no matter if Russia claims that some independent free rider hackers are attacking America or West from their territory, it doesn't matter. So that was a point about if the attacks come from your territory, no matter your claims that you control them or you don't control them, there will be a retaliation from the American side. Yes, Russia is a threat in this, but China also. And on the cyber issues in Europe, there's a consciousness about Chinese threats, and especially on industrial and economic espionage, which is not yet the case with Russia. So the Chinese are viewed as really a threat about, because Chinese are copying everything, and in a few years they make the same technology as the West, and Russia is not even able to copy and to make to compete with Europe on this. That's why maybe on this issue again, China is a threat, economic threat, military threat, and Russia is more like security threat, political threat, and using these disruptive measures politically more than economically.
Thank you, Tornike, very much, and Andreas, thank you very much for your very, very valuable and thought-provoking ideas and reactions on the certain developments. I hope very much that there will be more of NATO and Georgia, Ukraine and Georgia's mentioning in upcoming new summits and new communiques, but it needs 24/7 work from the authorities. I fully agree with Tornike, and I hope very much that Ukraine will succeed will be successful in doing reforms, not to give the ground for saying from friends in NATO that first you do the reforms and then we will discuss consider the membership. Without exaggeration, Georgia and Ukraine are in some areas are doing better than some NATO member countries, but this is all about the geopolitics, all about Russia and the hesitance of some European countries to make a decision on NATO and on Ukraine and Georgia's membership. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, your ideas, for your presentations. I hope very much we will stay in contact and we will be able to invite you for which we will organize in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tornike. Thank you, Alex. I was listening attentively and learned a lot.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.